Hello and welcome to Just One Q, the podcast where we explore the latest ideas in workplace belonging in conversation with thought leaders and experts. Each episode, a guest and I dive into a question that highlights their area of expertise. The goal is to leave you with tools and insights you can use to make your workplace better and more human-friendly. I'm your host, Dominique. I'm an inclusion educator and advocate working for Dialectic, an inclusive workplace learning consultancy in lovely Guelph, Ontario, which is situated on the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional lands of the Chinungtan and Haudenosaunee peoples. Joining me today is Rachel Shaw, the president and principal consultant of Shaw HR Consulting. Rachel has more than 20 years of executive-level HR experience, and she is recognized across America as a leader in helping employers manage their most challenging disability-related personnel issues. She is known as the authority on how to implement and manage the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, Disability Interactive Process for candidates and employees. Her trainings and seminars are highly sought out by HR and risk management professionals as they are informative, dynamic, and packed with real-life practical solutions. Rachel is also the author of the industry best-selling and award-winning book, The Disabled Workforce: What the ADA Never Anticipated. And along her career trajectory, Rachel has served as the director of HR for the city of Oxnard, which is a city in California known for endless golden beaches for all you Canadian listeners. And prior to that, she was the HR director for the Montebello Unified School District. She's a graduate of Brown University and later earned an MBA from Colorado State University. Rachel, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Dominique, for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk about this important topic.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to have you here today, and especially to add you to the many voices and perspectives that we've had on the subject of workplace disability inclusion on Just One Q. I previously have had the privilege of speaking with Dr. Carrie-Ann King and Dr. Ludmila Praslova and Sydney Elaine Butler on the subjects of disability inclusion and neuroinclusion in past episodes. And they've each shared such a unique angle on this important workplace and societal issue. So I want to encourage listeners also, if you're interested in this topic, go catch those episodes as well. But in our explorations of this topic so far, we've given a lot of space for the perspectives and experiences of disabled and or neurodiverse people, which, I think really needs to be honored and amplified and recognized as the cornerstone of inclusion work. And in today's conversation, we're going to look at access and accommodation more from an HR and employer perspective, and hopefully learn some actionable solutions for employers who might feel a bit stuck or overwhelmed as sort of the arbiters of who gets accommodated and how. So the question that's grounding our conversation today is, as we collectively recognize and redefine disability as a society, are employers ready for broader accommodation needs? And before we jump straight into this, Rachel, I'm hoping that you can do just a tiny bit of background on, what is the ADA and its main purpose for people who don't know coming into this conversation.
Yeah, so there's similar laws in a lot of countries, but the basic idea is ensuring that employers are removing both physical barriers, think of ramps, stairs, accessible restrooms, making sure ergonomic equipment and things are available. So removing physical barriers that might keep someone who can absolutely do their job, but needs some physical support to get in and out of a workplace, but also remove those barriers within the workplace for people who have visible or invisible disabilities and folks that may have accommodation needs, whether it's a psychological disability, it's neurodiversity, or whether it's a physical limitation. And the idea is really requiring employers to do the right thing. And kind of the basis of, I think, the law is, in a perfect world with perfect humans, we wouldn't need laws. We wouldn't need to have compliance requirements. But the reality is that employers often do not tend to want to change the workplace. They want to have a workplace be very similar to whatever their preferences are.
Mm-hmm.
And so what these laws are is these laws make it expensive and make it a requirement that employers act against their worst senses to exclude people, and makes it an obligation to remove unnecessary barriers so people can not only access work, but then perform the work either physically in the workplace or if they work on a hybrid or remote. And if employers don't follow that compliance obligation and they get sued and they lose, it's very expensive. Because, we would like to tell people, I always say, I focus on both hearts and minds. I would love to change people's hearts. And I do feel like that's sort of the underline of what I do every single day. But if I can't change their hearts, I'm going to change their minds, and I'm going to make sure their pocketbook understands the risk if they don't. So it's sort of that It's setting that expectation for society, but then it's mandating it so that there's real consequences if employers don't do what they need to do in that area.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to hear that it has teeth, right? And these are, disability rights that are really hard won. I wanted to mention, like, I'm not an ADA expert by any stretch of the imagination. I'm a Canadian, so I know very little about it. But if anyone's interested in learning more, something that I have seen is the 2020 documentary called Crip Camp, A Disability Revolution, directed by Jim Lebrecht and Nicole Newnham. And it really does a great job of transporting you to that time when the ADA was being kind of negotiated and when those disability rights advocates were pressing to make it happen. So just as a side note, just a really cool documentary and can give you a better sense of sort of the lead up to the ADA. And for our Canadian listeners, just to highlight what our equivalent legislation is, we have the Accessible Canada Act, or ACA, very similar to ADA, which came into force only in 2019, actually, and has the overarching goal of, realizing a barrier-free Canada by 2040. And it's very similar. The Act rather aims to kind of eliminate and prevent those barriers and ensure greater opportunities for persons with disabilities or disabled people. Employers are also bound by the Employment Accessibility Act, which sets out requirements for reasonable accommodation to the point of undue hardship, and also the Canadian Human Rights Act, which specifies disability as a prohibited ground of discrimination. And then to complicate things, we also have provincial legislation like the AODA, or Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act of 2005, which applies to me here in Ontario. So that addresses employment also and requires employers to enable equal participation in employment. So we have kind of a whole slew of equivalent legislation here in Canada, if anybody's interested in kind of digging in. Okay, let's get into it. So Rachel, you recently wrote an article for At Work magazine in which you explained that 54% of employees say they want to work from home full time, and that employers have also seen a rise in disability-related accommodation requests for remote work as they attempt to return workers to physical workspaces post-pandemic. Help us understand what's going on here. Is this suggestion that people are using accommodation requests inappropriately or something else?
I would say it's something else, but this is a great example of why the work that I do is so important in some industries and in some employers. There are some employers where every accommodation request they get is a yes. And if that is your culture, don't change it. Keep doing that. You don't need me. I don't need to be spending time in there as well. But this is a great example of when employers, especially we're seeing in America, this real focus on returning to the physical office, getting people back after they sent many employees home. And people don't want that. Disabled, non-disabled, they do not want that. And what happens is what employers feel is that employers are feeling that if someone, for example, is told you now need to come back to the office full-time or part-time, some employers are feeling and deciding that employees are making up that they have a disability if they get denied as a personnel process. And the whole goal of the work that I do is, look, you can have feelings, but your feelings can't guide your actions. So if you believe someone is saying, I want to work remotely and they get denied, and then they say, I medically need to work remotely, here's a medical note. What a lot of employers are doing is they're getting angry, or they're having emotions, or they're feeling it's not legitimate. And what my work does and the law does is it says to an employer, you have no idea what that person may or may not need. And when someone is being naturally accommodated, they don't need to ask for an accommodation, which is what a lot of access advocates are really pushing for. So, we had folks that were working in person before the pandemic. They are sent home, in March of 2020, and some employers had people work from home for years. And what I think, the ableist parts of some people or the non-disabled folks think is, well, you didn't need it before, so you don't need it now. And I think what is so important is we need to explain and help employers understand this is the heart's part of it, right? Before we get to the minds part. But the heart's part of it is, there are folks that had no idea how hard and how much they were diminishing their wellness by physically getting themselves to an office every day. They had no idea that it was an option or that they would feel so differently and medically be healthier until we sent them home. And you sent them home. And then they were home and they realized perhaps for the first time they could lower their medication, or they could actually have something left in the physical bank account or the mental bank account for their family on the weekend. They didn't have to take as many sick days. And so when that reality was taken away, we're seeing these requests for accommodation, and they're legit. Most of the accommodation requests in my mind are legitimate. But what happens is employers, because they've decided they want return to office, there might be a political reason, a tax reason, and there might be some other
A power reason,
a
sure.
power reason, a
Yeah.
baby boomers in charge reason,
Sure.
And so then what happens is they're getting angry and they want to take actions based on their feelings. And what I tell folks is you can have whatever feelings you want, but you cannot assume that you're correct because that's using your power. And so what we do instead is say, look, if you're not going to say yes, and you're concerned that you don't want to provide this accommodation, you want an alternative, maybe find a way to support them in the workplace, or you think it's not needed, you've got to go through a process. You can't simply say no. You can't simply judge that. The laws require, the compliance is required that you provide reasonable accommodation in Canada and America and in many countries. And so what employers need to do is then work in an interactive process, gather some data to challenge their own, beliefs or perceptions.
Sure.
Are there some people who might not need to work remote and they're saying they need it? There might be, not in every organization, but I think that there's a belief by a lot of employers that it's like 95% of people asking to work remote now because of a disability. There's this belief that it's not legitimate. And
Right.
that's where I can't change their mindset, but I can change their decision making if I get data and allow data to guide the process instead of how they're feeling. So that's a great example of sort of where we are with that. And it's an emotional one. Employers are very emotional about that type of accommodation right now.
Yeah.
In 5 years, everyone's going to work hybrid or remote if they can. But right now, it's a real emotional piece for people.
Yeah, it is a tug of war, right? And I'm happy to hear you say that employers are really feeling that it is an emotional experience, and that it's not necessarily legitimate to think that
Right.
there's people misusing. I mean, there are always people who are going to be misusing systems. That does happen, but it's a tiny minority in most cases, right? So people who have only sort of mainstream awareness of workplace accommodation conversations might imagine that disability refers to apparent disability. So things like wheelchair use or hearing or vision impairment. But I want to ask you, because you're steeped in this work, what are most workplace accommodation requests really about?
Yeah. So very few of the accommodations that sort of get to the level of needing more process are about physical limitations, walking, wheelchairs, hearing, or vision. Most of them are workers' compensation injuries. So an employee who might get injured on the job and then have physical limitations. It's psychological disabilities. So someone who might have either depression or anxiety or some sort of psychological disability, a way that they might process data or information, and they're needing accommodation. So most workplace accommodations deal with if someone's asking to be in the workplace, it revolves around physical limitations or psychological accommodation needs. We also have probably the biggest category for some industries, not every industry, but some industries is leave. So disabilities where the person can't be accommodated to work, what they're asking for is either consecutive or intermittent leave. And so those are the ones that are really challenging employers. And usually that's once the employee is already in the workplace. Yes, we have issues with if someone can see the disability or someone discloses it, employers may make poor choices on hiring someone. So don't share your disability. You have no obligation to, if you have an invisible disability, you have no obligation to tell an employer on an interview, don't do it because you will never know if they're using that information. But for most employers, that's their struggle is once the employee is in physical limitation, psychological need, and then leave of absence accommodation needs.
And what does it mean for employers that, the majority of accommodation requests are coming from this category?
Yeah. A challenge for, again, in some industries. So mostly industries where there's face-to-face work, customer service, think of retail, think of food service, or warehousing where there's a physical component. So a lot of industries where there is either a need for attendance, a regular attendance, or there's a customer interaction point or a physical demand of the job, whether it's typing all day or whether it's physically lifting, pushing, pulling. Especially in those industries, what it means is that, if you have more than 5 supervisors, the risk of any employer, and the reason that HR is so important in this process is, the lived experience, which is often so beneficial in some areas. A couple months ago, you had a great pod on it, on lived experience and how that can really help. But in this case, a supervisor's individual beliefs, perceptions, lived experience regarding a disability, if they're the ones making decisions, if they're the ones that are deciding whether Joe, the custodian who can't do heavy lifting, is accommodated, that is extremely risky for the organization and for your disabled population. And so the role of HR is to understand that individual supervisors really can't be the ultimate decision makers without HR coming in and guiding that process, guiding it, morally, ethically, and legally. Because if you leave it up to asking 5 supervisors, can you accommodate no heavy lifting for a custodian, you're going to get a lot of no's, mostly no's. And the one yes you might get is probably a relationship-based yes. And the reality is we have no idea what heavy means for that individual human. We don't know what that means. We know what the job traditionally requires. We don't know what they can lift. And then, of course, we've got to then evaluate whether there are ways to overcome or mitigate that limitation so they can still do their full job. Because this is not a law that says someone with a disability is going to do less. And people with disabilities who want to work aren't asking to do less. But they do need employers to modify how they assign the work, require the work to be done, maybe the hours it's done or the equipment that's used. And that's where you got to get someone like HR to come in and be, the Jiminy Cricket, the moral center of the organization that really pushes past an individual supervisor's perceptions, beliefs, biases, because if those are guiding decision-making, traditionally, in my experience doing this work now, 26 years, you're going to have a lot more no's. A lot more supervisors saying, no, we can't accommodate that difference, that disability. And we do not want that. We want as many yeses as possible. And that's why we need to come in there and make sure that data is guiding decisions and process is guiding those decisions.
Yeah. So the role of HR then is just bringing that clarity, cutting through the emotion. And in those higher volume of request situations, their role becomes just so much more important, right? Yeah. If you don't have the type of organization where you can just say yes. And I want to talk about believing people just for a second. So because I've had a lot of conversations with disability advocates who say how important it is to just simply believe people who request accommodations, and that placing the burden of proof on people can further disadvantage people who may not have access to medical care or medical diagnosis. So I just want to quickly address that because we're talking about processes and we're talking in many cases about data and proof. And so how do we balance those concerns?
I mean, it's a super fair question, and it's never a great balance. I can tell you the work that I do benefits and supports people with disabilities, and that's the whole focus, because unless you have an advocate supervisor, human nature is not on the side of diversity in the workplace. We tend to hire, promote, and support people that think like us, believe like us, watch movies like us, and that is something that I think, I've become very aware. I haven't seen the change with the work that I've done. I'm not seeing people becoming more willing to accommodate. In some ways, I'm seeing a little bit less of that. And so, when we're getting into and we're looking at how do we support, and we need to make sure we're not adding unnecessary barriers. Like you shouldn't have to ask for places to have breaks. We should be constructing and building workplaces so that we're thinking of all the users. And that's not happening. When we build workplaces and we put the microwave at 6 feet tall, that is not thinking about someone who might have a wheelchair access or might have that need. And so there's things I think we can do to make it easy so that really commonsensical accommodation stuff doesn't have to be begged for, doesn't have to be proven. What we often see with employers is usually what's happening in the workplace is there's one of 3 things going on that causes a person with a disability to say, I need to out myself, I need to identify. And usually that someone is either struggling with a performance matter, there might be an attendance issue, or there's a safety related matter. And so usually if it's attendance, performance, or safety, if something's going on in the workplace, and if that supervisor or manager is perceiving that as performance management or even discipline, they're looking at that issue with attendance, performance, or safety, and the supervisor's thinking, well, that is not good. I'm not going to promote you, or you're not going to get a raise, or I'm going to let you go. Oftentimes, that's where we see an employee say, the reason I'm struggling to meet your attendance, performance, and safety issues is because my disability in this, square box of a workplace that wasn't built for me, is not working for me. And in that case, what we often see is in almost under every law, there's an obligation to first confirm that you have a covered disability, which is yes, everyone does. I wear glasses, you wear glasses. We have a covered disability, right? It's not a high threshold. But then the second thing is to determine what are their functional limitations or how does the disability affect them. And so for a lot of employers, it's the process of, unfortunately, when the employer might believe, maybe they believe there's a disability at play, or maybe they think it's a performance matter. And then the employee is saying, no, it really is that disability, and trying to find a way, we call it the right tool. what's the right tool? If the goal is meeting attendance, performance, and safety standards in the workplace, making sure you have a safe workplace, you can do the work, it's not impacting your disability, you're meeting performance standards. If the employer's thinking the tool is performance management or discipline, and the disabled person is saying that's not going to work because I need an accommodation, it's no big deal. But that's where sometimes we see the proving, right? And I do think that there are circumstances where employers do believe that there is a disability, but sometimes the requested accommodation is not a preferred accommodation. And so what happens is employees feel like, look, me and my doctor know exactly what's best for me. This is what I need. I need to work from home, or I need a 410 schedule, or I need to work on the B shift, or I need a corner office, or whatever. And that may be absolutely what that employee and their doctor believe. An employer may say, and they have the right to say, we understand that might be your preferred accommodation, but if that's not best for our workplace, or we would like to seek out alternatives, it's that request for that information to be able to open up, because the law says you will get a reasonable accommodation. You may not get your preferred accommodation.
Right.
And that is where oftentimes, it can feel like you're calling that person with a disability a liar. We don't believe you. You're not important. And that's why when I train HR, I train HR on this 4-step process. And there's 2 key conversations. You have to communicate with people. You have to explain to them what you're doing and why. And I tell HR, if you think someone's asking to work from home and you have some reason to believe that it's not legitimate, I had an employee who said she was so medically fragile, couldn't be around anyone. If she got a cold, she could die. But then she told her entire workplace on a Teams meeting that she was going on a Carnival cruise. Love Carnival Cruise, nothing against them. But, cruises are infamously sort of germ-ridden, right? And so we had the right to ask a question, but I tell employers, then say that. And if you believe someone, you know they have the need, then say that as well. But I do feel like employers sometimes hide behind process, and they have to be ahead of process with really key, honest, human-centric, compassionate conversations where they understand the experience, they talk to the employee, they listen to what they're saying, and then they use that information to make sure that their process is appropriately aligned. And a lot of HR professionals, I feel like some of us have forgotten how to talk to humans. And that is a skill that we need to bring back in. You can't AI your way out of HR. So I get it, and it's a reality. And I think conversations help, but there are going to be experiences where an employee is asking for the employer to modify the workplace. The employer is going to want more data, and the employee is going to feel that they're not being believed, or they're having to prove their disability. And I don't have a perfect solution for that.
Yeah, I mean, that tension it's so tricky, right? Like the idea of a human-centered workplace, and then the idea of these data-driven decisions. When I think of the former, I'm thinking of those conversation-led approaches, empathy, giving people what they need, basically. And when I think of data-driven approaches, I'm often thinking of the possibility of having to say no to somebody who might be asking for support to work better. So I think that you're bringing attention to the importance of that conversation, which I think is so critical. Do you have any tips for what that conversation could feel like or sound like?
Yeah. So I call it my intro conversation. So when an employer is triggered to start an interactive process, right? And you need to talk to someone. They're an equal part of the process, right? And so when you are triggered to start that interactive dialogue, what I always tell employers is that first reach out is to say, here's what I understand. You either verbally requested, or you brought in a medical note, or there's a belief that you may have a disability affecting your attendance, performance, or safety. And you talk to the employee, talk to me, help me understand. And I'll give a great example. One of the things that often comes up is someone who might be struggling psychologically, may need to take breaks during the day. And that is a great example where when you talk to the employee and you say, talk to me, what does this look like? They may share with you, look, I may never need it, but if I am feeling overwhelmed, I may need to take an unscheduled break. I may need to go find a space that I can be in, and I can use some of the strategies that my therapist and I are working on. And some employers want to hear that, and they want to get right into process. Well, here's a questionnaire, and what I tell employers is human-centric is to say to someone, now look, you got a 40-hour week job, you work 8 hours a day, you have customers coming in. So it could be a problem if you're just walking off the floor and we've got a line of, but let's try it. Let's give it a week. Let's give it 2 weeks. Let's try it. And so what I try to do is explain to employers, when you're having that conversation, you need to really talk to that human who's asking or in need of an accommodation as if they are an equal partner, and listen to them. And if they're saying something like, I really think I can figure it out. I know it's not really clear what I need, but it's not a safety issue. No one's going to die because I tried this accommodation. Try it. If it doesn't work, you've gathered data, right? So sometimes data comes from a healthcare provider. I once had an individual I was working with who unfortunately had an amputated leg. And his doctor wrote that he would need breaks when it was hot outside to be able to deal with basically the synthetic cover on his amputated leg would get slippery and it could fall off. And he was a groundskeeper. And so the employer was freaked out. He's going to get hurt. He's going to need so many breaks. He'll never get his job done. And, I talked to him and he said, oh no, it's not going to fall off. It just gets slippery and I can get, agitated skin. And so he's like, I don't know how many breaks I'm going to need. I don't know what hot is. I've been out of the workplace for 18 months. So we tried. And the first 2 weeks, the guy took an extra hour and a half of breaks every day. That's a lot. Now, he could have just extended his day and worked 9.5 hours to get the 8 hours of paid time. That could have been an option. But we said we were going to try for 4 weeks. And by the third week, he had no breaks other than he got 2 15-minute by the employer and 1 30-minute lunch. He had no extra breaks. And so I talked to him because he's a human and he's important to this process and he's an equal partner. And I said, talk to me. And he said to me, oh, Rachel, so I figured out that, if I bought 4 extra silicone sleeves for my leg, then I could just change them out at my 15-minute morning break, my lunch and my afternoon break. And my coworkers smoke. So when they took their smoking break, if I needed an extra break, I would go change out. And so I never had an issue. That's a data-driven decision, but the data came from a try because we were willing to say, you're human. We believe you have your best interest and our best interest. We both want you to work. And we're going to try that. And so that's an example of where data can come from that human-centric approach. Sometimes the data looks very different. Someone wants to work remotely. There's rumor that they moved 7 hours away. And so that conversation might be with the employee, hey, it may have nothing to do with it, but you were working in person before COVID. We understand that you moved about 7 hours away. We're assuming the commute would be difficult. Is that true? Did you move? Does that have anything to do with it? And, there's a concern that we want to make sure we're not providing preferred wants. We only want to be providing reasonable accommodations. You can say that. You might be wrong. And you can say, look, I don't know if I'm right, but we're going to ask your doctor, what are your limitations? Why do you need the remote work? Is it sitting? Is it standing? Is it driving? Is it commuting? What is it about it? And so that's a way to have what I think is a very honest human-centric approach. Because if you're saying to someone, hi, I understand you want this, here's a questionnaire, and you're not saying those words, and they think you think they're lying, you're going to lose a relationship opportunity with them. So I always say, you can share your feelings, but your feelings don't guide your actions. Data does. And you can share why you want to get information, but be open to being wrong. And you're going to oftentimes find out either you're wrong and there is a need, or there is an alternative. And gathering that data might help you and the employee both agree to that alternative instead.
So if I'm an HR professional and I'm engaging in these conversations, what are the most challenging things that might get in my way? Like, is it supervisors, is it their attitudes, or is it, just what are the, why doesn't this happen more? Why isn't this approach sort of universal?
Part of it is very few organizations, unless they're very large, have anyone whose job is actually accommodation. Normally what happens is an HR professional they have this thing in their job description that says other duties as assigned. And that's happened to me over 26 years ago. Someone just gave it to me as this brand new employee to do this really important compliance piece with no education or experience. So you have folks that are oftentimes they're not trained, they're not prepared for the job, they haven't had any formal training or education on how to do it. And I also think there's a lack of understanding there needs to be consistency and that there is a way. Part of it's because the law doesn't tell you how to do it. It just tells you that you need to do it. And if you don't do it, you'll get in trouble. And so part of it's just that people don't have the training and experience. I think that is a part of it. There is a reality, and I know that a lot of your audience is not HR people, so I kind of feel like I'm not trying to like call out bad workplace issues. But what we know is that we need to remove the opportunity for individual humans to make decisions based on their beliefs and biases. And when it comes to disability, human resources needs to understand that they have to create process that focuses on getting information and data, but also guides supervisors and managers in making these decisions
Mm.
because the impact is so great.
Mm-hmm.
Disenfranchising a human could impact an entire, the next 4 generations of that person. It could
For
change your
sure.
culture. And so I do think the biggest challenge is supervisors and managers who tend to lean to no, or they make decisions based on relationships with employees. And you don't, you know, there's a lot of C-minus employees that are not disabled in the world that we tolerate. And yet the minute someone with a disability wants an accommodation, there's an expectation that if they're not an A+ employee, they don't deserve it. And we have to make sure that we're not having higher expectations for people with disabilities than we do for people without. And that's really where HR comes in, is we neutralize and we kind of protect the organization. I don't tell a supervisor, hey, you're bias is shown. Well, sometimes I do, but I don't tell them, but I say to them, look, I understand you have these concerns and
Mm.
I hear you, but we don't know what heavy, forceful, repetitive means. We don't know why they're requesting to work remote. But if you're telling me that's an issue, I'm going to go and do my job, get this information, and then I'll come back to you and help guide the right decision.
Mm.
And I think that's challenging. And HR professionals need to understand your job is not to make the C-suite happy. Your job is not to make your employer, happy. Your job is to do the work, the compliance work, the culture building work. And if you make everyone a little unhappy, you're probably doing a great job.
What
And
a
I think
lonely job. What a lonely job.
yes, I always say but we get to feel, I mean, when I walk out of a room and I've made the right decision happen, I feel good because I've got a
Mm.
higher purpose than my paycheck coming from this one company. I always tell HR professionals, at night, you go home and you put your head on your pillow and you got to live with yourself. And you do
Mm.
not want to be reworking in your mind, thinking, that someone was harmed and lost a job, didn't get a promotion, lost their medical benefits because I wasn't willing to do the work, to gather the data, to find a yes and ensure that if a yes was found, it was implemented.
Mm.
And I really hold HR professionals to a much higher account. I think they are the most important part of an organization. We're the soul, we're the culture builders. And if we're not doing our jobs, we can actually cause a lot of damage.
Mm. Yeah, I wanted to ask you specifically about whether you've seen sort of a need for HR to step up in this sort of anti-DEI era that is certainly very apparent in America and to a lesser extent in Canada, but we are having a lot of pushback to what was a very kind of progressive cultural movement for quite a few years there. Are you feeling that? And is that affecting things in terms of disability accommodation?
We are absolutely feeling this big pushback. And I do think it's HR's responsibility to keep saying the words. There's nothing bad about equity, inclusion, and diversity. There's nothing bad about it. And everyone benefits. Everyone has, everyone came out of someone's, body, right? Everyone has someone in their family who has either for age, disability, gender, race, religion, sexual orientation, and everyone has benefited from having that. We know. And so I do think, and I think what I always think about every issue in hearts and minds. And I believe that HR needs to make sure that we are prepared to have the conversation with the leadership that, fine, if your heart's not in the right spot, if there's some belief that you have, let me get your pocketbook and your mind in the right spot.
Right.
When a female CEO runs a company, that company is 20% more profitable. When you have a diverse workforce, when you have diversity in your C-suite, you have an organization that's 19% more productive, has less turnover. 70% of all the workforce, the folks you're going to need to hire, right? People under the age of 40 right now, they want a diverse workforce and they want to stay in a culture where they can see themselves. They want to see, oh, there's someone that looks like me, that needs like me, that has accommodations like me, that believes like me. They're ahead of me. That means I have potential. And so it's just good business.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I believe, of course, I believe in DEI. I believe that it's our obligation to push for that, because as soon as we become more diverse in the boardroom, in the decision-making positions, in the supervisor positions, as soon as that happens, we won't need as much compliance process because we will have more voices, more perspectives, more lived experiences making decisions. And, and it's not every industry, but right now we do have a stagnation in diversity in the C-suite arena, in the decision-making, and in some industries, right? In industry specific, where I work in a lot of more physically demanding industries. So I do think it's HR's job to not shy away from it. I think we need to be bold. We need to not be afraid of the word. I think we need to challenge when someone does. In America, in 2023, we passed Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. And I mean, it's such a commonsensical law, but it is. So I train across the United States, and I've been training in red states, which for us means states that are more conservative, right? Typically more anti-DEI. Not, this is very general. There's
Yep,
amazing people in everywhere.
of course.
But I'll train in these states, right? And I'll have these conversations. And I feel like it's my responsibility as someone who's going in there, because the whole idea of the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act is pregnant women can work during pregnancy. So then they can take leave when the baby comes, and pregnant persons, right, can work. So those pregnant persons can then have leave and have all their leaves left, right? So they're not burning their leaves during pregnancy. And it is kind of, I mean, it's sort of like when you have an authority, an opportunity, and a voice, you got to make it like it's just like water's wet.
Mm-hmm.
It just is, right? There's no drama to it. It's commonsensical,
Yeah.
and when people want to get upset about it, say, most persons don't have 50 kids. So get over it. It's a couple, maybe. I mean, I think the birth rate in the United States is like 1.7 children
Yeah.
right?
Less than two. Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot of that. And I just think we have an opportunity for leadership.
Yeah.
We have an opportunity to just be bold about it. And then for me, I'm just hoping we're going to survive through it, and we're going to get back to a commonsensical conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that
disability.
idea. Yep. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, people always forget that disabled people are part of the DEI inclusion. Like, people often don't even think about disability as being part of that. They think of some other whatever they decide. And so, I've been speaking a lot about, oh, you're all about having a disability. Well, that's DEI. And this is why it's so awesome, right?
Yeah, I like your idea of, if you can't get the heart, then get the mind. And the idea that, it just is good business sense. And it's a future-proofing move for businesses, right? To have accommodation policies and to have process in Canada. And I'm assuming it's similar in the United States. There's also very much like a cultural movement associated with disability disclosure. And about a quarter of Gen Z are disclosing some sort of neurodivergence or disability. And that is a huge proportion of the workforce. So as that generation moves through and the stigma is sort of removed from disclosure, we're going to get, it is regular people. It is like,
right. I mean,
disabled people are us. And so it's just so important to future-proof organizations and to have that, that in mind.
Shout out to Selena Gomez, right?
Yeah, yeah.
When people, I mean, nobody should have to disclose information, but when you can, when you have an invisible disability, and when you have someone like a Selena Gomez, who is amazing and powerful and a businesswoman and successful and rich and beautiful and all these things, and she's disclosed her disability to the world, it changed a lot of perceptions. That's why it's so important that there's representation.
Yeah.
And because people think, oh, I saw that movie where that person, they decided to stop taking their meds, and we have all these beliefs that people adopt because they choose to believe it. And so it's so important. You need to see. I worked with a second grade teacher that we got back to work after she lost all of her limbs through sepsis. Second grade teacher went back to work, had one prosthetic arm. She was in a wheelchair. She went back to work. She taught for another 4 years. And I mean, the fact that those students saw I mean, this has been some time now, but I'll guarantee you, when they're in a job interview in maybe 15 years, and they have someone who comes in and might be in a wheelchair with a physical disability, they're not going to see that person as less than. They're going to think of that amazing second grade teacher they loved with all their heart, and they're just going to see it as something like hair color. And that's why it's so important that we allow both visible and invisible disabilities to be represented. It matters, representation matters so much. It changes mindsets and it changes the future.
Absolutely. Yeah. That was my conversation with Rachel Shaw, President and Principal Consultant of Shaw HR Consulting and author of The Disabled Workforce, What the ADA Never Anticipated. Thank you so much to Rachel for bringing us an HR perspective on accommodations, particularly in those environments with high volume requests and where the default answer tends to be no. If you are interested in learning more about implementing data-driven decision-making that cuts through bias, check out her book, which I'll link in the show notes. And you can also find Rachel on LinkedIn and on the Shaw HR Consulting website. I'll also drop a link to the documentary Crip Camp, which I mentioned near the top of the episode. After this episode, I do want to lay something out on the table because building an accessible world is really close to my heart. And what we didn't get to touch on in this interview is access and how it is different from and so much more than just accommodations, which we did talk about. So if your workplace doesn't really fit the description of a place where no is the default answer to accommodation requests, I want to encourage you not to rest on those laurels too long because there is so much to be done. And I want to yield the floor a little bit to lovely disability advocates that are doing this work. So I'm going to read 2 quotes. The first is by Stephanie Cawthon, who wrote Disability is Human, the Vital Power of Accessibility in Everyday Life. And the second by Tiffany Yu from her book, The Anti-Ableist Manifesto, both of which I highly recommend. Stephanie Cawthon writes, access is more than accommodations. Accommodations are inherently transactional. A disabled person puts in a request, the system responds with an answer, and access is granted. Although accommodations are essential and non-negotiable part of accessibility, they are just a starting point. The challenge arises when accommodations become the endpoint, and there is little consideration of what happens outside of that request fulfillment process. Despite the attitudes, language, content, and spirit of what is said, if ableism is present, then accommodations are but a small band-aid. To parallel the phrase, culture will have your strategy for lunch, without an accessible mindset, accommodations only offer limited positive impact on overall inclusivity. And Tiffany Yu writes, the fact is that accessibility isn't just about building a ramp or making sure videos have captions. In the broader picture, accessibility goes beyond disability to highlight various other inequities in an intersectional world where disabled people are also queer, people of color, poor and working class, parents, and more. This is why accessibility can also look like having a sliding scale for fees, flexible schedules for work, options for online participation, and venues that provide childcare or have gender-neutral bathrooms, as well as being mindful of police presence and acknowledging Native communities and the land we work and live on. So thanks again to all the amazing disability advocates out there for doing the work. And if you want to learn more or talk about this, feel free to reach out to me and I'd be happy to have another conversation, whether on this podcast or off the air. Also, please feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to be a featured guest on this podcast or if you'd like to sneakily nominate someone. I really love having conversations with L&D, HR, and DEI professionals who are passionate about their message, or with folks in adjacent fields who have something to teach us in these people and culture and learning roles. And if you like what you're hearing, please leave us a rating and a review or share this episode to your own socials. It truly does help get the podcast into more ears. I'm Dominique. Thanks so much for listening and see you next time on Just One Q.